I hid an Apache mom and her child. Now she wants me to father the next one and stay forever. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The last stretch of daylight faded across the valley as William Harrow carried a load of chopped wood toward his cabin. The temperature had dropped fast, giving the air a sharp bite that stiffened his hands even through worn gloves. He moved with the steady discipline of a man who depended on routine to keep his thoughts contained. His life had narrowed over the years into work, silence, and distance from any situation that demanded emotional involvement. He had chosen this patch of land because few people traveled this far west unless they had no other choice. William set the wood beside the door and straightened his back, feeling the familiar pull in his shoulders from years of ranch labor and long rides. He reached for the latch when something caught his attention. A faint movement broke the stillness near the tree line, a shift that didn't belong to the wind or the animals that usually pass through at dusk. He focused on the pines, eyes adjusting to the muted light. A woman stood partly concealed behind a leaning trunk, her frame tense and angled, as if she was ready to run if he so much as moved toward her. She carried a child pressed tightly against her chest, wrapped in a blanket that barely held warmth anymore. Her breathing was shallow, the kind that came from exhaustion mixed with fear. Her clothes were travel-worn and patched by hand, showing she had been moving for days with no rest. William didn't call out. Experience had taught him that loud voices only made a frightened person distrust him more. He slowly lowered his hands, keeping them clear of his belt and rifle, and took half a step back from the porch. The gesture was deliberate. He wanted her to see she had room to approach if she chose. Years ago, on the cattle trails, his judgment had failed during a storm and cost another man his life. He had carried the memory into every decision since, careful never to force someone into a situation they could not control. The woman studied him without blinking. Her face was marked with dust and strain, but her eyes were sharp and alert, scanning him for any sign of threat. She didn't look weak. She looked like someone who had held herself together for her child's sake long after her strength should have given out. Her thoughts were easy to read. She was deciding whether stepping closer to his cabin meant safety or another danger she couldn't afford. Her legs trembled slightly from fatigue, not fear, as she tightened her hold on the child as if preparing for the worst. William opened the cabin door wider, the hinges creaking as he stepped fully out of her path. He didn't speak. He didn't gesture her inside. He simply made space, leaving the choice to her. The valley had taught him that people running from something needed control over every step they took. After several long moments, she stepped out from the trees. Her movements were steady but slow, each one measured as she crossed the open ground. The child's small hand peeked from the blanket, clutching the fabric with the kind of instinct children develop when danger has followed them too long. When she reached the porch, she paused again. William met her gaze without trying to soften his expression. He didn't want her to mistake sympathy for pity. He only wanted her to see that he meant no harm. She crossed the threshold without a word. Inside the cabin, the stove gave off steady warmth. The room was simple: a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot, and tools hung neatly along one wall. She moved toward the heat immediately, lowering her shoulders a fraction as the warmth reached her face. The child pressed against her, too tired to lift his head. William pulled a clean, folded blanket from a trunk and placed it on the chair closest to her. Her eyes flicked to it, waiting to see if he expected something in exchange. When he stepped back and began removing his gloves without looking directly at her, she reached for the blanket. She wrapped it around the child first, her hands shaking from the cold and from holding her composure for too long. For the first time, her voice came out low and rough. "I won't stay long." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was protective, shaped by the need to avoid burdening anyone who might turn her away later. William answered in the same even tone he used for skittish horses and troubled men. "Heat's here. Night's coming quick. You can rest." Her eyes softened just briefly, not with trust, but with relief that someone had given a direct, practical answer. William hung his coat and went to the stove to adjust the vent. He didn't try to question her. He didn't ask where she came from. He could tell by the tightness around her mouth, the rapid breaths she forced quiet, and the way she positioned herself between him and the child that pressing her for details would only heighten her stress. She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting how he moved around the cabin. She read his behavior with the instinct of someone who had survived encounters with men who didn't hide their intentions well. She saw the lack of urgency in his steps, the absence of judgment in his expression, the distance he kept out of respect rather than avoidance. It wasn't kindness, not in the shallow sense. It was deliberate restraint. She lowered herself onto the floor beside the stove, settling the child on her lap. The boy's breathing steadied as he absorbed the warmth, his small fingers relaxing for the first time since she had stepped from the trees. She brushed his hair back with a tenderness that revealed how long she had carried the weight of keeping him alive. William sat at the table, trimming the wick of a lantern so it wouldn't sputter later. He kept his movements slow, understanding that sudden actions in a confined room could unsettle someone who had been running. He wasn't used to sharing his cabin with anyone, but he felt no irritation. Instead, a quiet concern settled in his chest, surprising him with its strength. He wondered what had driven her here. Raiders, displacement, tribal conflict, or something worse, but he didn't let the thoughts show on his face. He knew better than to reopen wounds someone was trying to hold together. She didn't look away from him now. She was watching him for signs of impatience or anger. Her expression carried exhaustion, but her posture remained ready to shield the boy. She was preparing for the possibility that she had misjudged him, even as the warmth eased her guard. The stove crackled softly. Outside, the wind settled into a low hum across the valley. Neither of them spoke again. The woman's name was Tala, though she hadn't offered it yet. William didn't press. Names would come when trust did. For now, she and the child were warm, and he had decided, without needing to think further, that he would not send them back into the dark. The door stayed closed. The night deepened. And inside the cabin, three lives adjusted to one another's presence for the first time. A thin line of pale light crept across the cabin floor as dawn broke over the valley. William woke before the sun had cleared the ridge, as he always did, but the weight of the room felt different. The quiet breathing of two unfamiliar people changed the rhythm he had grown used to in his years alone. He sat up slowly, giving his eyes a moment to adjust, and listened to the faint crackle of cooling embers in the stove. Tala was already awake. She sat near the hearth with her back straight, holding her child close beneath the blanket he had given her. Her eyes tracked him with alert caution, but her shoulders no longer carried the rigid tension of the previous night. The warmth had softened her guard just enough for exhaustion to settle into her bones. The boy slept heavily against her, the rise and fall of his chest even and steady. William stood and moved toward the stove, keeping his steps quiet so he wouldn't startle either of them. He added small pieces of kindling and coaxed a flame from the ember bed. He didn't speak. He didn't want to interrupt the fragile calm forming between them. Tala watched his hands, noticing the slow, controlled motions he used to avoid loud sounds. She recognized it as deliberate consideration, not hesitation. She shifted the blanket around her child, making sure the cold air from the window didn't reach him. Her fingers brushed the fabric with practiced care. She wasn't merely keeping her son warm. She was checking that he was still safe, still breathing easily, still away from whatever danger had driven them here. When William finished stoking the fire, he set a pot of water on the stove and glanced toward Tala. "There's food," he said quietly, "if you want some." He didn't gesture or force the offer. He simply stated a fact and gave her the space to choose. Tala hesitated, unsure whether accepting food would place her in his debt. After a moment, she nodded once. It wasn't trust, but it was a beginning. William stepped outside to gather more wood before the frost hardened the ground. The air met him with a sharp chill, carrying the scent of frozen earth and pine. He scanned the horizon without conscious thought, instinctively checking for movement or signs of trouble. Years of living alone had trained him to notice the smallest disturbances in the land. Today, his vigilance had a clearer purpose. Inside the cabin, Tala slowly stood and walked toward the table, testing the room with quiet steps. Every sound felt louder when she made it, a reminder that this shelter wasn't hers. She placed her son on a folded blanket near the stove, keeping her body angled in front of him so she could reach him quickly if anything felt wrong. The child stirred but did not wake. Her thoughts raced with questions she could not yet voice. Could she stay longer than one night? Would this man tolerate their presence for more than a morning? Would the danger behind her eventually reach this place? She had spent months running without pause, losing companions, food, and shelter to violence and separation. Standing in a room where she wasn't forced to move immediately felt unreal. William returned carrying a stack of wood. Tala tensed for a moment, then relaxed when she recognized the same steady posture he had shown the night before. He set the wood near the stove and hung his coat on the hook. She spoke first. Her voice was rough from travel and disuse. "We can help with work. I don't want to stay for free." William met her gaze with calm honesty. "I didn't ask for payment." He paused, letting the words settle. "You're here because night fell. That's enough reason." Tala looked at him carefully, searching for motives she might have missed. She saw no impatience, no attempt to corner her with kindness. Instead, she saw a man shaped by solitude, carrying guilt he didn't name, but still capable of drawing a boundary between what he offered and what he expected in return. The pot began to simmer. William prepared a simple bowl of oats and placed it on the table. Tala helped her son sit upright, supporting his back with one hand while feeding him slow spoonfuls. The child watched William between bites, studying every movement he made as if trying to decide whether this man belonged to the world of danger or safety. William noticed the boy's attention but didn't interact directly. He didn't want to overwhelm him. He continued moving through the cabin with measured steps, making sure the pace remained steady and predictable. After they finished eating, Tala began cleaning the bowl with water from the bucket. William didn't stop her. Her need to contribute was clear, and refusing her would only heighten her discomfort. He stepped outside to check the fence line, leaving the door open just enough so she could hear where he was. Tala stood at the doorway with her child on her hip, watching him scan the land. His eyes moved methodically across the horizon, not in fear but in readiness. She understood that kind of vigilance. It was the behavior of someone who had lived through a mistake and never wanted to repeat it. She whispered to her son, "He might let us stay for a while." The boy leaned his head against her shoulder, sensing her uncertainty. When William returned, he caught the tail end of her expression. Not hope, not relief, but a cautious acceptance that this place might hold for more than one night. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he pushed open the door and placed his tools on the table. "You can rest today," he said plainly. "There's no rush to decide anything." Tala studied him again, absorbing the meaning behind the statement. He wasn't giving her orders. He wasn't trying to take over her decisions. He was offering time, something she hadn't had in months. For the first time since she arrived, her shoulders eased not from exhaustion, but from the possibility of safety. The morning settled into a steady rhythm. The cabin no longer felt like a place she was passing through. It felt like a place that was allowing her to breathe. Morning returned with a colder bite than the day before. A thin frost clung to the dirt outside the cabin, giving the ground a brittle sheen as William stepped out to check the animals. Tala stood in the doorway with her child tucked against her hip, watching him cross the yard with deliberate, measured steps. She still studied him every time he worked, learning his habits, his limits, and whether his patience had an end she needed to be careful not to reach. Inside the cabin, the air carried the smell of warm ashes and dried herbs from William's small storage shelf. Tala walked toward the cupboard, noticing one of its hinges dangling loosely again. She touched it with her fingertips, testing the wobble. She did not like disorder, especially in places where she needed to feel safe. Fixing things had become a way for her to keep control over small parts of life she could reach. William returned as she gathered a handful of nails from the table. She paused, uncertain whether taking the initiative would irritate him. He didn't show any sign of disapproval. Instead, he stopped a few steps inside the cabin, observing her with a quiet curiosity. He had seen many travelers, many wounded families, many people just trying to survive, but Tala's instinct to repair rather than retreat struck him in a way he wasn't prepared for. "You can fix it," he said simply, choosing each word slowly. Tala nodded once and knelt before the cupboard. Her child sat beside her, tracing lines in the dust with a small piece of wood. She steadied the hinge, aligning the metal with practiced care, then tapped each nail into place with the smooth end of a wooden spoon. The cupboard door closed evenly now. She tested it twice, making sure it wouldn't sag again. William placed a sack of grain on the counter and watched her without intruding. He noticed the way her hands moved, small, precise motions from someone who had spent years mending belongings rather than replacing them. His chest tightened slightly, not with pity, but with respect. The child rose and wandered toward William with cautious steps. The boy lifted his arms, imitating William's earlier motion from outside when he carried supplies. William lowered himself slightly to the child's height, an unspoken signal that the boy could approach if he wished. The boy stopped directly in front of him, studying his face with serious eyes, then handed him a small stick as if offering a tool for work. William accepted it without smiling, but the warmth in his eyes was unmistakable. The child returned to Tala's side, satisfied with the exchange. As the day settled, Tala began preparing a pot of stew using dried vegetables from William's shelves. She tasted nothing until she confirmed it was mild enough for her son. She moved with a steady rhythm, stirring the pot with one hand while adjusting the child's blanket with the other. William worked near the window, sorting tools that had been scattered during a storm weeks ago. The quiet inside the cabin felt different than before, less like three people trying not to disturb each other, and more like a home adjusting to movement, voices, and warmth. Tala broke the silence first. "You keep things clean," she said softly, not as a compliment, but as an observation. "I try," William replied. He didn't elaborate. He had lived alone long enough to know that order built stability. Chaos reminded him of the trail, the shouting, the uncertainty the night he made the wrong call. She stirred the pot again, noticing how he avoided looking directly at her when he admitted something personal. She understood that pattern. She carried her own truths behind controlled expressions. Later, when the stew was ready, she handed him a bowl. William accepted it with steady hands. He tasted the meal silently, registering the flavors without comment. Tala watched him for a brief moment, expecting some sign of disapproval. Instead, he placed the spoon down and nodded once, a small, honest acknowledgement that her cooking was good. The boy ate beside her, leaning against her arm. His breathing was calm, his movements unhurried. For the first time since arriving, he did not grip her clothing with fear. After the meal, Tala reached for the pot to wash it, but William stepped forward and took it from her hands. "You fix the hinge," he said. "I'll do the rest." It wasn't a reward. It wasn't trade. It was a statement that the work in the cabin was beginning to divide naturally between them. As he washed the pot, Tala sat on the floor with her child, brushing dirt from his hair and adjusting his shirt. She watched William's back, noting the small tension that stayed in his shoulders even when things were calm. She wondered what part of his past kept him alert even in his own home. Her mind drifted toward her own memories, cold nights, abrupt escapes, voices calling behind her in anger, and she pulled her child closer. She wasn't ready to tell William everything, but she could feel her fear loosening its grip, settling into something quieter now that she knew he wouldn't push her away. Night approached slowly. Tala lit a small lamp, the faint glow spreading across the wooden walls. William finished stacking the tools near the door, placing each one with measured precision. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Neither spoke, neither looked away. The silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like two people acknowledging that something unspoken had begun to shift. The cabin held more warmth than the stove alone could provide. The space between them was still cautious, but steadier. A fragile sense of belonging, unclaimed but present, had taken root in the corners of the room. The sun was barely above the ridge when William finished feeding the animals. Frost clung to the fence rails, turning every surface rigid and pale. He walked back toward the cabin with slow, steady steps, working the stiffness from his fingers. Tala stood near the doorway with her child wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the cold settle across the yard. She didn't shiver. She had spent too many nights exposed to worse weather. Still, her eyes followed William with a quiet calculation, as if measuring whether this place might hold through the season. Inside, the stove gave off a dense warmth that softened the sharpness of the morning. Tala helped her son sit near the hearth with a small wooden cup William had carved from scrap, a gesture he'd made without explanation. The child traced the cup's smooth rim, fascinated by its shape. After checking the fire, William carried a bridle and a leather strap to the step outside. He sat with his back straight, bending the stiff material in his hands. The boy followed him halfway, hesitating at the threshold before sitting with his cup in the doorway, close enough to watch, but far enough to retreat if needed. Tala stepped outside as well, adjusting her shawl around her shoulders. She took a seat a few feet from William, not near enough to intrude, not far enough to appear distrustful. She studied the leather he worked on, noticing the frayed edge and the care he used to reset the stitching. "You fix everything yourself?" she asked quietly, her tone neither curious nor invasive, just a simple prompt. "Mostly," William replied, tightening the stitch with controlled pressure. "Keeps things steady." She understood the weight behind that word. Steady meant predictable. Predictable meant safe. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind brushed through the dead grass, making faint, brittle sounds. Tala watched the boy play with the cup, drawing shapes in the dirt with its edge. Her gaze softened as she observed him, then hardened slightly when she remembered the months of fleeing, the faces she had left behind, and the threats that had followed them farther than she expected. She shifted her eyes back to William. "Something happened to you too," she said, not as a question, but as a fact she had pieced together. William continued working the strap, but his rhythm changed. A small hitch in the motion revealed he had hurt her more deeply than he showed. He tied the knot and set the bridle aside. His jaw tightened once before he spoke. "I made a bad call on the trail," he said. "Storm came in fast. Hard to see more than a few feet. Thought the herd would hold if we pushed through. I was wrong." Tala kept her posture still, knowing he was navigating uncomfortable terrain. "A man riding beside me went down," William continued. "Horse slipped. I didn't see him fall until it was too late. By the time we got back to him," he paused, not for dramatics, but because the memory sharpened in his chest like something pressing from the inside. Tala waited. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't ask for details. She allowed the silence to give him room. "I knew his family," William said finally. "His wife lived 2 towns over. I rode out there and told her myself." He let out a faint breath. "I left the trail after that. Didn't want to be responsible for anyone else." Tala observed the lines around his eyes, the strain in his shoulders. She recognized the way guilt settled into a person, slow, relentless, shaping every choice that followed. She had carried her own burdens for years, though hers came from survival rather than decision. "You stayed alive," she said softly. "That man would have wanted that." William didn't reply. He watched the boy in the doorway, clinging to the cup while whispering to himself in a low, rhythmic tone. Tala followed his gaze. "My husband died on a cold night," she said. "Raiders found our camp. I took the boy and ran. There was no time to bury him." Her throat tightened slightly, but her eyes remained steady. "I thought I failed him by living, but the child needed someone. So I kept walking." William listened without shifting his body or changing expression. He understood the weight behind her words. He recognized the exhaustion of carrying another person's memory while trying to protect someone still living. Their conversation drifted into a calm silence. Not uncomfortable, just honest. The boy stood, taking careful steps toward William. He held the wooden cup out with both hands, offering it like a small tribute. William accepted it, turning it gently in his fingers. "You like this?" William asked quietly. The boy nodded once, solemn and direct. William handed it back. The boy stayed beside him a moment longer, leaning slightly against his knee before returning to Tala. She smoothed his hair with a quiet tenderness. then looked back at William. "You protect people even when you don't plan to," she said. "I can see that." William didn't argue, though a small shift in his breathing gave away the effect her words had on him. He stood, picked up the repaired bridle, and looked toward the pasture. Tala watched him for a moment, noticing how he held himself with a firmness that came from years of keeping distance between himself and others. But now, she saw a slight change, an openness he hadn't shown her on the first night. He walked toward the barn to put the bridle away. Tala gathered her son and followed toward the cabin, sensing that William's honesty had opened a quiet path between them. Their pasts didn't match, but the heaviness in their hearts mirrored each other closely enough that understanding came without forcing it. For the first time since arriving, Tala felt her fear loosen, not because danger had faded, but because someone finally stood beside her without asking for anything in return. The day no longer felt like a pause between threats. It felt like a step towards something steadier than either of them had known in years. By late afternoon, the temperature fell again, announcing another cold night before the sky even darkened. A thin crust of ice formed along the rim of the water bucket outside, and the wind carried a dry whistle through the gaps in the barn boards. William stacked extra wood by the door, knowing the cabin would need steady heat until morning. Tala stood near the stove with her child beside her, warming his hands over the small flame she kept alive throughout the day. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of simmered vegetables and dried meat from the pot Tala had prepared. The warmth spread slowly across the room, softening the stiff corners of the cabin and giving the space a sense of quiet settlement. It was the kind of warmth that encouraged slower breathing and lowered shoulders, even if neither adult entirely relaxed. William stepped back inside, brushing the cold from his sleeves. His eyes scanned the room out of habit, making sure nothing was out of place. He noticed Tala sewing one of his shirts. She had found it near the trunk earlier, torn along the sleeve. She hadn't asked if she should mend it. She just did. Her hands moved with steady confidence, guiding the needle through the cloth with even stitches. He stood near the table, watching her work without approaching too closely. He didn't know how to express gratitude without sounding clumsy, so he stayed quiet, letting the soft rhythm of her sewing fill the space. Tala sensed him watching, but didn't look up. Attention didn't unsettle her when it came without threat. Her child sat a few feet away, playing with small pieces of what William had shaped into simple blocks the night before. The boy arranged them in careful lines, occasionally glancing up to ensure neither adult moved too far from him. Every now and then, he touched the hem of Tala's skirt for reassurance. As the daylight faded, snowflakes drifted lightly outside, each one catching in the lantern glow before dissolving. William walked to the window and adjusted the cloth tucked into the small gap near the sill to block the draft. He checked the latch twice before stepping back, a habit Tala noticed and silently appreciated. When she finished sewing, she set the shirt on the chair closest to William. She didn't announce it. She didn't explain the repair. The offering was quiet and sincere. William picked it up, turning the fabric in his hands to inspect her work. The stitches were clean and evenly spaced, better than anything he could have done himself. "You did this well," he said, his tone low and direct. Tala nodded once, accepting the acknowledgement without expression. She wasn't used to praise. She was used to survival. The cabin's atmosphere changed gradually as night settled in. There was no tension, no hovering fear, only a sense of unfamiliar comfort neither of them trusted yet. William took a seat at the table, leaning forward with his elbows resting lightly against the worn surface. Tala sat on the floor with her child, keeping him wrapped against her as she hummed softly in her own language, a steady, calming sound that flowed more like reassurance than song. William listened with quiet focus. He didn't understand the words, but the sound affected him in an unexpected way. It created a stillness he hadn't felt in years, something that softened the edges of the room. When the boy fell asleep against her shoulder, Tala carefully lifted him and placed him on the folded blanket near the stove. She brushed his hair back with slow, gentle strokes before pulling his small coat around him to catch the heat. After making sure he was settled, she stood, and moved closer to William. Not too close, just close enough to show she was ready to speak. "The storm will get worse later," she said, eyes fixed on the window. "My people always move before nights like this." "You're safe inside," William replied. He didn't promise anything beyond that. He didn't mention danger or the riders or the risks she carried. He gave her facts she could trust. She looked at him, considering his words. There was no boast in his voice, no attempt to claim authority. Only certainty born from experience. Tala took a slow breath. "You check the windows twice. You don't leave tools outside. You know what waiting danger feels like." William held her gaze. "I keep things ready. That's all." But she could see the truth beneath his restraint. He was preparing the cabin not only for himself, but for her and the child. He hadn't said it aloud because he didn't feel entitled to say it. Instead, he showed it through each careful action. The lamp flickered once as the wind pushed against the walls. Tala turned toward the boy, ensuring he didn't stir. William added another piece of wood to the stove, watching the flames rise with controlled attention. Tala stepped closer, her voice lowered. "You don't push people away. You just stay quiet because you've lost someone." William glanced toward her, surprised by how precisely she read him. The tension in his shoulders eased, not fully, but enough to show her words had reached a place he usually kept locked. Silence settled between them again, different from the silence of strangers. This one carried understanding, shared grief, and an unspoken recognition that both had walked through loss in different ways. Tala returned to her seat near the boy. William remained by the stove, standing watch over the room without announcing he was doing so. Outside, the storm built slowly, wind scraping across the land like a warning. Inside, three people existed in a fragile but growing rhythm, one shaped not by obligation, but by small, steady decisions that brought them closer each day. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt the shift. Something was forming, quiet, deliberate, and unmistakably real. The next morning arrived with a clear sky, the storm having passed during the night. The air felt sharp but clean, carrying the scent of wet earth and cold pine. William stepped outside early, boots sinking into patches of softened ground as he checked the fence that bordered the pasture. Tala watched him from the doorway with her child in her arms, the boy still sleepy but curious. William found a rail that had loosened during the storm and knelt beside it, pulling his toolkit from the corner where he'd left it. He began resetting the mark where the wood had shifted, his hands steady despite the lingering chill in the air. He didn't notice the child slip free of Tala's hold until small footsteps approached him across the yard. The boy stopped a few feet away, gripping a thin stick with both hands. He studied William with a seriousness far too old for his age. William lowered the hammer, tilting his head slightly so the boy wouldn't feel overshadowed. After a moment of careful observation, the boy held out the stick as if volunteering for work. William accepted it with a small nod, then pointed to a safer section of the fence. "You can help here," he said, voice low and even. The child moved to the designated spot with surprising purpose, copying William's motions with the stick. When he tapped the wood and heard the faint hollow thud, something unexpected burst out of him, a short, bright laugh that startled even himself. The sound traveled across the open yard, brief but pure, cutting through the heavy mood that had settled over all of them in recent days. Tala stood frozen for a moment. That laugh hadn't escaped her son since before they began running. She covered her mouth with one hand, the corners of her eyes tightening as emotion rushed through her. She didn't cry. She had taught herself not to, but her breath trembled once before she steadied it. William kept working, but he slowed down enough to let the moment settle. He glanced back at the boy, who repeated his tapping motion with growing confidence. The child laughed again, this time quieter, but with a softness that warmed something deep in William's chest. He didn't smile fully, but a faint shift in his expression revealed more than words could. Tala walked toward them, her steps slow as if fearing the sound would stop if she moved too quickly. She crouched beside her son and brushed dust from his cheek. The boy looked at her briefly, then pointed at William in a wordless announcement. He made me feel safe enough to laugh. Tala met William's gaze. For the first time, she didn't look guarded. She looked grateful, openly so. He hasn't done that in months, she said, her voice low but steady. William didn't answer immediately. He set the last nail into place and stood, wiping dirt from his hands. Kids know when danger's close, he finally said. He doesn't feel it here. Her breath caught at those words. Not because he promised safety. He hadn't, but because he recognized her son's fear without pity. The boy followed William as he walked toward the barn, tapping his stick on rocks and fence posts along the way. Tala watched the two of them with an expression that blended relief and uncertainty. She hadn't expected William to allow the boy so close. She hadn't expected her son to seek out a stranger on his own. Both realizations unsettled and comforted her at the same time. Inside the barn, William reached for a small block of wood he had cut the night before. He handed it to the boy without speaking. The child turned the block in his hands, examining the smooth edges with wide eyes. Tala stepped forward, studying the gesture carefully. "You made that for him?" she asked. William shrugged lightly. "Had extra wood." But Tala knew better. Nothing about William was careless. He had made it intentionally. The boy sat in the straw and began tapping the new block against the old one. Tala watched him relax fully for the first time since they arrived, his shoulders loose, his breathing slow, his focus fixed on simple play. She turned to William. "You don't realize how much this matters," she said. William leaned against the barn wall, crossing his arms loosely. "He needed something to do," he replied. But Tala saw through the understatement. For a long moment, neither spoke. They watched the boy together, silent witnesses to a child reclaiming a piece of himself that had been buried under fear. Eventually, Tala stepped closer to William, close enough that the cold from outside still clung to her shawl. She lowered her voice. "You carry your past like a weight, but you help without thinking. Not many men do that." William looked away, uncomfortable with the clarity of her observation. "I just try not to make things worse," he said. "You haven't," she answered. "Not once since we came." Her tone held no softness, no attempt at flattery. It was the plain truth from a woman who had learned to measure people by their actions rather than their words. William exhaled slowly, not sure how to respond. He felt something shift inside him. Not emotion exactly, but a recognition that this small family was no longer just passing through. Their presence had altered the pace of his days, the silence of his nights, and the heaviness of his thoughts. Behind them, the boy laughed again, this time louder. Tala closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound settle deep within her, anchoring her in a moment she never expected to feel again. The wind passed gently through the barn doorway. The child played without fear. And for the first time, all three occupants of the land shared a morning that felt solid, something that could be built on, something that did not tremble under the weight of past losses. A quiet certainty took hold between them. None of them named it, but all of them felt it. The cold deepened again by late afternoon, settling over the valley with a stillness that warned of another hard night. William spent the day repairing the roof seam above the cabin's eastern wall, working with a determination that came from more than simple upkeep. Tala noticed it from the yard, how he checked every board twice, how he paused now and then to scan the tree line even when there was no movement. He was preparing the place as if more than just himself depended on it. Tala helped him by handing up nails and holding the ladder steady. She kept her son wrapped against her back with a woven cloth, the child resting calmly as she braced the ladder's legs. She didn't speak much, but her presence beside him was steady and sure. William worked faster than usual, aware of her shoulder brushing the ladder, her hands ready to stabilize anything that shifted. When the final nail was set, he climbed down carefully. Tala stepped back as he reached the ground, and their eyes met briefly. Neither smiled, but something quiet passed between them, an acknowledgement that this wasn't just routine maintenance. It was preparation for shared living, even if neither had said so aloud. "You'll be warm tonight," William said, testing the strength of the repaired seam with a gentle push from below. Tala nodded. "It will hold through the wind." Her voice carried something new, not gratitude, not obligation, Acceptance. They walked back toward the cabin side by side, close enough that their arms nearly touched. Inside, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. Tala set her son near the stove, letting him stretch his legs while she prepared tea from a small pouch she carried. William sat at the table, hands resting loosely against the wood, watching her as she moved through the cabin with a familiarity she hadn't shown on earlier days. He realized she no longer hesitated before touching things inside his home. She no longer waited for permission to adjust a blanket, stir a pot, or organize the dishes. She had begun treating the space as if she belonged in it, not as an intruder, not as a temporary guest, but as someone who expected to wake up here again tomorrow. Tala poured tea into 2 cups and set one in front of him. She didn't ask if he wanted it. She had learned his preferences without needing to be told. William lifted the cup, feeling the warmth seep into his hands. The child lay on his side near the stove, tracing lines on the floor with a small block. Tala watched him quietly, her expression softening as she saw the calm in his movements. Then her face changed, not in fear, but in decision. She turned back to William. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was steady and heavy with meaning. "I need to ask you something," she said. William's hand tightened slightly around his cup. He didn't answer, waiting for her to continue. Tala sat across from him, placing both hands flat on the table, as if anchoring herself. The lantern between them cast thin shadows across her fingers. She took a long breath, preparing herself to speak with complete honesty. "My son needs a place that will not change," she said. "If we keep moving, he will grow with fear as his guide. I don't want that for him." She paused, watching the words land in William's expression. He didn't look away. He didn't interrupt. "I cannot protect him alone anymore," she continued. "I can feed him, I can guide him, but I cannot build a future without support. Running keeps him alive, but gives him nothing to grow on." William understood more from her tone than her words. She wasn't asking for shelter. She was asking for stability, a life built on solid ground rather than constant escape. Then she added the part that reshaped the room completely. "If I am to give him a real home, it must be with someone who chooses us. Not by accident, not by pity. Someone willing to stand in the place where he will learn what it means to be safe." His breathing slowed. The space between them grew heavy, not with pressure, but with clarity. Tala wasn't offering herself in desperation. She wasn't asking for rescue. She was proposing a future built on mutual willingness. She held his gaze, unflinching. "I want another child someday," she said quietly. "Not to replace anything I've lost, but to give my son a sibling, a family that continues beyond fear. If that happens, it must be with a man who accepts us not because he has no one else, but because he chooses to stay." William swallowed hard. The weight of her request pressed deep into him. He wasn't a man who spoke easily about responsibility, but he understood commitment better than most. He had carried guilt for years, and he had lived under the belief that he didn't deserve the trust of others. Yet Tala was offering him a chance to step into something steady, not as an escape from his past, but as a way to build something new. He looked at her hands on the table, then at the child curled by the stove. His thoughts twisted in quiet conflict. He had lived alone for so long that sharing life felt alien. But Tala's words stirred something he hadn't felt in years, a pull toward connection that didn't frighten him. He didn't answer right away. He stood abruptly, needing the cool air to think. He stepped outside, shutting the door gently so the child wouldn't wake. The sky had turned a deep blue, the first stars beginning to show. William's breath formed white clouds as he exhaled into the cold. He stared at the ridge, the trees, the land he had chosen to hide in. Could he choose something different now? Could he let himself be responsible for more than his regrets? Inside the cabin, Tala stayed seated at the table, fingers intertwined tightly. She didn't panic at his silence. She didn't doubt the worth of her request. She knew William needed time. He was a man who weighed every decision with care. Minutes passed, quiet and still. Then the door opened. William stepped back inside, his face unreadable. He moved toward the stove, warming his hands. Tala waited. He didn't give an answer with words yet. Instead, He looked at the child sleeping peacefully near the fire, then at Tala, her posture straight, her eyes steady, her courage unmistakable. His silence was not rejection. It was the beginning of acceptance. A decision had begun forming in him, slow and deliberate, and Tala recognized it instantly. The course of their lives had shifted even before he spoke a single word. The night passed with a calmness none of them expected. The wind rattled the branches outside, but the cabin remained steady, warm, and quiet. William barely slept. He sat at the table long after Tala and her child had drifted off, staring at the wood grain beneath his hands as if the decision waiting inside him was carved somewhere in its lines. Tala slept lightly near the stove with her son beside her. Every so often she stirred, checking the boy's breathing, adjusting his blanket, then glancing toward William. She saw him sitting upright, unmoving, thinking with the intensity of a man who had been alone too long to take commitment lightly. She didn't interrupt. She knew men like William needed silence to reach clarity. Just before dawn, he stood and walked outside. The cold hit him immediately, but he welcomed it. The air was sharp, honest, unforgiving, much like the life he had lived until now. He stepped across the yard, boots crunching over frozen earth, and stopped near the fence he had repaired the day before. His breath rose in slow, steady clouds as the first hint of daylight pushed over the ridge. He imagined the cabin empty again. He imagined the silence. He imagined returning to the routines that had once kept him steady but now felt hollow. And then he imagined the boy laughing in the yard. He imagined Tala humming near the stove. He imagined their belongings slowly filling the corners of his home. Something inside him settled. He turned back toward the cabin with the first real certainty he'd felt in years. Inside, Tala sat awake with the child still sleeping across her lap. The door opened, and she straightened, not frightened, but bracing for whatever answer he had reached. William stepped inside, removed his coat, and placed it on the hook with deliberate care. He didn't sit. He didn't hesitate. He walked to the small room he had rarely used except for storage and began clearing it, lifting crates, moving blankets, pushing aside tools. Tala watched in silence, eyes wide, unsure whether she was witnessing preparation or farewell. When he finished, he stepped aside so she could see inside. "I'm making this your room," he said plainly. Her breath caught, but she didn't move. She wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. William continued, his tone steady and certain. "You asked me to choose. This is me choosing." Tala rose slowly, afraid any sudden movement might break the moment. The boy stirred but didn't wake. She stepped toward the doorway of the small room and ran her hand lightly over the empty wall, feeling the smooth, cold wood beneath her fingertips. "You're sure?" she asked, voice low but unwavering. "This life, you understand it won't be simple." William met her gaze without looking away. "Simple isn't the goal. Staying is." Her eyes softened, truly softened, for the first time since she had arrived on his land. She released a long, controlled breath, as if finally setting down a weight she had been carrying for years. He wasn't done. William returned to the main room, pulled an extra chair from the corner, and placed it beside hers at the table. Not across from her, beside her, a small detail, but one that made the meaning impossible to overlook. "This home can hold us," he said quietly. "If you stay, I'll make sure of it." Tala approached him, hands trembling faintly now, not from fear, but from relief she didn't know how to express. "And the child?" she asked, needing to hear it said aloud. "He's mine to protect too," William answered. The boy woke then, blinking sleep from his eyes. He looked around, confused for a moment, then toddled toward William with his small carved block in hand. William crouched low and lifted the boy into his arms with a steady, practiced grip he didn't know he possessed until now. The child rested his head against William's shoulder with complete trust. Tala's throat tightened. She placed one hand on her son's back and the other lightly on William's arm. No words were needed. The three of them stood together, the warmth of the stove brushing across their skin as the first rays of sunlight reached the windows. A new family had formed, not through blood or ceremony, but through choice, labor, honesty, and the simple act of refusing to walk away. Later that morning, William repaired the remaining cracks in the cabin walls. Tala folded blankets for their new room. The child followed them back and forth, carrying his wooden block like a prize tool. There was no fear in his steps now, only curiosity. William paused near the doorway, watching Tala and her son organize the small space that would soon become theirs. Tala turned toward him, her expression steady, her eyes full of something that reached deeper than gratitude. "We'll build this together," she said. He nodded once. "We will." The valley outside was cold but calm. The land they stood on was rough, isolated, and far from easy, but it was theirs now, something solid beneath their feet. For the first time in years, William felt the weight on his shoulders lift. For the first time since losing her husband, Tala felt a future forming where fear was not the only guide. For the first time in his young life, the child had a home that wouldn't disappear. No uncertainty remained. No question lingered in the air. They had chosen each other, fully, deliberately, and without reservation. And that choice would hold.